Hey, today we are going to learn a little bit about what we should be doing with our lawnmowers as the upcoming mowing season is coming. And today I'm joined by Wes here from Toro. Wes is the technical service manager from Toro. And Wes, I'm excited to have you on today. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, John. It's nice to meet you and spend a little time together.
Yeah, and it's really good to be looking at the upcoming mowing season. I have to say, as someone who loves mowing, this is an exciting time of year for me.
Yeah, this is our Super Bowl, right?
That it is. So people are just about ready. They're itching to pull things out. You know, the snow is pretty much gone. Well, we'll have a little bit more probably before the season's over. But it's time to kind of think about what we should be doing to get our machines ready for the season. So for
You
those
bet.
people who've got kind of like a walk behind machine, a push mower, what kind of things should a push mower owner be kind of looking at as they're ready to pull their machines out for the season?
Yeah, there's a few things you want to consider. A lot of it has to do with how you stored it. So let's assume it was stored like most of us store our outdoor power equipment, which is poorly. Um,
And we'll get, for those who are watching, we're going to cover towards the end of the video
yeah,
how to
let's
do it
come back
right.
to that.
We'll come back to that. Yep.
Yes, really, there's three different things you want to consider when it comes to pulling out your lawn equipment. Um, you need it to run well, you need it to cut well, and you need it to move well. So we need to take a quick look at those things and make sure that's happening for you. Um, Oftentimes we run into fuel-related issues with getting into the springtime. The fuel with ethanol in it, which is a good product, provides some challenges when it comes to storage and shelf life of fuel.
Sure.
Ethanol being an oxygenator, it serves a purpose. Ethanol is in there for more combustibility. It burns a little hotter and it's cleaner. The downside of that is it's hydrophilic, meaning it attracts water. So we got to watch out for that. These things don't run very well on water. So if we can make sure that we can get that water out of there, and we've got good fuel in it. Some damage may have been done over the winter. Now that's typically going to be up to your local shop or your authorized Toro service dealer, whoever you may use, to take a look at that.
Mm-hmm.
So before you get into any of that stuff, you need to ask yourself if you're comfortable with performing that repair, that maintenance yourself.
Right.
Always keeping safety in mind as well. So what we'd like to have you do is change oil. People neglect that quite a bit. And this is all part of it all has to do with temperature. It comes down to temperature. That's the number one killer in this industry is temperature on small engines, transmissions, hydraulic transmissions, belts, spindles. Heat kills. So we need things to run cool and we need them to run clean.
Sure.
And the cleaner you have them, the cooler they're going to run. So we'd want to make sure that that oil is getting fresh because antiquated oil starts to lose its viscosity, creates more friction, creates more heat.
Yeah.
And we want to stay away from that. So let's get the good stuff in there. At which point you'd also want to pull the spark plug, and more often than not, you should just go ahead and replace that spark plug. Unless you're a pro and you know how to read a spark plug and tell how it's burning, you probably don't want to start guessing that its life or its health.
And when you're talking about the spark plug, people generally can figure out how to remove it and look at it. But the parts that they need to understand is that there's a specific gap there, and there's some little nuances that if you don't, as you say, or if you're not familiar with that.
Yeah, if you take the guesswork out of it and spend the $5-7, whatever it is, and put a new one in there. Yeah, but you're right. The gap could be wrong. That gap could be deteriorated. We could see on the porcelain cone of the spark plug itself what color it's burning. That tells us how hot it's been getting, the quality of the fuel that's been in it. So us folks that deal with this every day, we could tell a pretty good story from a spark plug.
Mm-hmm.
Don't put that on yourself.
Yeah, for $5 or whatever it is, it's just easy.
Exactly. And oftentimes, including Toro, we offer maintenance kits that's going to come with everything you need for oil, spark plugs, air filters. So next, moving on to air filters. That's something that's highly neglected.
Yes.
They're fairly easy to replace. Some folks like to blow them out. I'm not an advocate of that. Unless you pay attention to the direction you're blowing the debris out of it, you could be damaging that air filter.
Yep.
If you're pushing that dirt back through the wrong way, it changes the micron of that filter. So now if you push those dust particles through that way, they can come back again. So now you've created a breach point, and you suck that air into a carburetor, ultimately gets in the combustion chamber into the crankcase. Now you're starting to really change the life of that oil that you just changed.
Right.
So the more dirt that thing sees, the worse oil is going to get. The hotter it's going to run, the more friction you're going to create, the hotter it's going to run, and ultimately lead to failure. So there again, for the dollar amounts, it's worth replacing that.
And the air filter, for those who are wondering, how often they should replace it. Of course, we're talking at the beginning of the season, but there are people who are in really dusty climates that probably need to be revisiting this maybe a couple of times.
Yeah, in fact, with tour equipment, we outline in the required maintenance that you inspect that air filter daily or before each use.
Mm-hmm.
You should be taking a look at that. It can change really fast.
Very quickly, yes. Dry grass and such, especially at the beginning of the season, and all of a sudden you've got all these little pieces in there. What happened? Where did this come from?
Yeah, and you get it in an area that's on the borderline drought, which, as we've seen the last number of years, there's not a lot of water coming at us anymore.
Yeah.
And, your soil can turn into dust pretty fast.
For sure.
So we need to combat that a little bit. And that air filter's working pretty hard every time that thing fires up.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, you're doing pretty good on a small engine on a walk power mower. We've talked about the spark plug. We've talked about the fuel and the air filter and the oil. So the mill of that thing should be in good shape. Now we need to consider, is it going to cut well? Is it going to move well?
Mm-hmm.
So you want to inspect your blade. And I should mention this too, if you are changing oil yourself, or if you're servicing the blade on that mower, you always want to tip that to the side where the air filter is up. If you tip that the other way, you fill that carburetor and air filter full of oil. So now, if you imagine trying to breathe through a rag soaked in oil, you can't do it either.
Yeah.
That little motor isn't going to be able to do it.
No.
So you always want to make sure that air filter's up. And anytime you're servicing the blade or looking at it, you want to disconnect that spark plug wire. You don't want any unintentional combustion there that could put you in a bad spot.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so you're going to want to inspect that blade safely and make sure that your edges are good and sharp. Look at the points of the blade and make sure they're not rounded off or anything like that. I think it's good practice to always have a backup blade in rotation.
Sure.
So, in spring, fall, whatever, midsummer, whatever you have to sharpen a blade, you have a sharp one to throw back on there. That way it gives your local shop time to sharpen that one up for you too. Oftentimes that's the heat of summer, shops can get real busy. Definitely. And you don't want to be without a lawnmower for 2 weeks because you have a dull blade.
For sure.
So it's a good idea to keep spare around.
And let's just talk about sharpening a blade, because I've had people asking about sharpening a blade, and they're like, well, it can't be that difficult. I sharpen my knives at home. It's a little bit different, because there can be, depending upon how dull it is to start with, there can be a lot of grinding and a lot of love needed to get that blade back into shape.
Yeah, you're right about that. And I spent a lot of years, a lot of time in a shop myself, and sharpened a couple of thousand blades. And oftentimes the question was asked, well, why would I have to pay you to sharpen this? I could just put an edge on it. My question to them, and it'll be to you, what angle are you going to sharpen that at?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's 30 degrees. How are you going to keep 30 degrees on there? You're going to guess at it.
Yeah.
So if you get that blade tip too fine or too blunt, it's going to change the way it cuts the grass.
For sure.
If you get it too fine, that edge is going to go away real quick.
Yes.
If you get it too blunt, it's going to tear the blade. If you ever drive through a neighborhood in the middle of summer and you can see different yards, and some you see like yards that are getting kind of brown, that was probably a dull blade.
Yep.
Because it loosens up the ends of the fibers in that grass blade, and it kind of fans out, and it has more surface area to take in the heat. So blades that aren't maintained properly can actually damage your grass pretty bad.
Very quickly, as you say, because it's instead of cutting, it's now ripping, which can be a problem. And as you mentioned, of course, the angle or the point, or however we want to refer to it, that's tough. And then one of the things I think people who are trying to do the sharpening don't pay any attention to is the blades have to be fairly well balanced. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of problem.
Yeah, you create some vibration in there, and it can run into a safety factor too, other than being uncomfortable. And it's a little strange, a little bit of an offshoot. But if you run a blade on a walk power mower that's out of balance, you'll start to notice rust spots on your deck because of where plastic parts meet the deck. You start to get micro abrasions in there, and it takes the paint off, and then you get a little moisture on there, and then you start seeing rust.
Interesting.
So we get calls about, what's wrong with my deck? It's not your deck. There's something else going on.
Interesting.
And when you run into that, sometimes too, it's because that blade has made contact with something it shouldn't.
Very much so.
And I will always tell you, any homeowner, if your blade makes contact with something that doesn't want to move, get that mower into the shop.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a bent crankshaft or a blade that's bent, you're putting yourself in harm.
Very true there. Unfortunately, I've seen things like that happen, and just
Certainly.
dumb things. You hit a piece of cement that you didn't even know was there because of doing some neighbor's lawn for the first time.
Yep, water main hitting the curb. Lots of things happen.
Yeah, for sure. So best to make
Right.
sure someone who's knowledgeable and such when it comes to that is helping you with that part of the process.
Yeah, you bet. You want a trained eye on something like that.
Very, very true. Very true. Okay, so the blade, we get it sharp or we have the spare and handle that. But now you're talking about also that it moves well.
Right. So if you have a self-propelled machine, like the Toro Personal Pace or any of our other models, when you've got that machine tipped up on its side, air filter up so you can inspect your blade. While you're in there, take a look at your drive belt. It's pretty easy to see. It's just a V-belt that runs from the crankshaft where the blade is connected back to the transmission or up to the transmission, depending upon the model. You want to look at that and just make sure it doesn't look like it's glazed over, burnt up, anything like that. If that looks good, then you can probably let that go. At which point, I'll get that back on all four wheels, and one at a time, make sure you just manually rotate those wheels and make sure they turn the way they should. Another thing that's commonly missed is there's a cable that runs from your drive control down to the transmission. It needs frequent adjustment. You're going to want to look at your operator's manual and see what that adjustment should be and how often you should be doing it. I can tell you now it's going to be at least once a year they're going to recommend it. That's what we do.
Sure.
But any of them should have a maintenance point to them because those cables begin to stretch. Belts begin to stretch as well.
Yes.
And if you're operating your drive with a cable that's not pulling the appropriate tension, you're probably damaging your drive belt. And I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to push a self-propelled lawnmower when the self-propel wasn't working.
Oh, yes.
It's much worse than not having drive at all.
That it is. That is.
Yeah, so you don't want to blow that belt.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned. Let's talk about that belt just a little bit more. You mentioned kind of a gloss to it. Let's kind of explain a couple of things that are commonly seen because I've seen a couple of these things, but I want to make sure I'm following you with what could be wrong with that belt.
Yeah, so when you're looking at that belt, there's the V portion of it. That's the part that makes contact with the V pulleys on both ends, be it the crankshaft or the drive. And if you've operated for a year or two with that cable being out of adjustment, you're not getting full pull on that tensioner for that belt in some models. So you start to have belt slippage. When that happens, we create heat, and heat will fail that belt, and it presents itself by those V faces being shiny. And you can even, like, if you try to stick a thumbnail into them, you'll feel that they're getting hard.
Okay.
Those belts should be replaced because you're going to lose traction on both sides. And the more traction you lose, the more heat you're going to create. And as we've mentioned, heat's the killer. So it just kind of snowballs from there.
And even if say the belt doesn't have any shiny spots on it from where it's been slipping, those belts do have a limited life. They're going to eventually need to be replaced because you're going to be seeing like little tiny cracks and such in them, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, you're right. And there's other things we'll see too. If you're operating in real sandy soil, you can actually wear down the pulleys from the engine side or the transmission side. We'll start to notice that V belt is sitting way down in the V of the pulley. If it starts sinking down too far in there, we know that pulley is both that belt and pulley have probably worn out. That typically takes a trained eye to understand what's going on there. But
in that situation, you'd probably notice that you're having more slipping where it doesn't seem to be engaging and pulling itself along.
Yep. Yeah. If you got a slight hill in the backyard or the case is, and now it seems like it's not pulling its weight very well, good chance you've got something like that going on.
Excellent. One of the things most of our mowers are two-wheel drive, whether it's rear or front, depending upon the type of mower. What about the other two wheels? I mean, let's say we wanted to lubricate them or to make sure that they're spinning freely. What could a person do with those?
Typically, that's a bushing wheel on a shoulder bolt, and it doesn't need a whole lot of maintenance.
Okay.
Now, some models vary. Again, refer back to your operator's manual and see what's called out there. And if you're anything like me, you probably don't have that operator's manual. Just about everything is able to be found online.
Yeah.
For sure, if you go to Toro.com, I know that all of our operators' manuals are listed by model number in there.
Nice. They can go in there and search and find it and be able to find out what's the best way to deal with it. And in many cases, you'll find maybe there could be a frozen bushing or something in there. And the best way to deal with that is, again, just a quick visit to your local Toro repair.
Authorized service dealer.
Yep, they can help you out with that.
Yeah.
Nice. I want to visit the gas part a little bit again. I know we're bouncing all the way back, but you mentioned, of course, moisture, and one of the old things when I grew up as a kid, and there was whenever Grandpa would say there's moisture in a gas on the old tractor, he would go get some sort of a little chemical to put in there that was supposed to take the moisture out. Now,
Sure.
I would think that when you're doing something on such a small scale as a mower, that is it would be a complete no-no. You wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, well, and there's a little bit of snake oil in some of that stuff too.
Okay.
As far as dissipating that moisture, it's pretty hard to do, especially in small engines like we're talking about. So your best bet to help yourself is to prevent that from happening. So our recommendation is going to be to use non-oxygenated fuel that does not have ethanol in it, so it doesn't have that hydrophilic property that attracts water to a degree. It all does a little bit. But if you can imagine, especially in storage, if you have ethanol fuel and a sealed gas can in the garage, any moisture condensation that builds up goes right into that gas. So you need to be aware of your fuel storage practices there as well. So to try to prevent that stuff, you need to be proactive versus reactive. There's fuel stabilizers that help quite a bit. I'm a big fan of the Toro's premium fuel stabilizer. I use it in all of my gas-powered stuff.
Sure.
Follow the directions and let it do what it's supposed to do. A lot of people think that if a little is good, a lot is much better. You got to be careful with that.
It doesn't always work that way.
Yeah, I remember having machines come into the shop that carburetors were full of fuel stabilizer.
Oh.
Yeah, so you helped yourself right into oblivion when you did that. Yeah. So you need to be aware of that. The best thing to do is, as I stated, try to use some non-oxy fuel and buy small quantities and buy often. Shelf life of like an 87 octane, just regular pump gas these days it starts to turn at about 28 days.
Wow. Yeah,
it's pretty quick.
Yeah, just as you say, better to buy more often than to try to store it for the season and then find out.
Yeah, and then you try to push yourself because you own the fuel, so you're using this fuel that's been sitting around for a while, and it can lead to gumming of the carburetor, and even worse, you can have intake valve stick because the valve stem gums up from that poor fuel that you're running through there, and now that valve can stick open, you could have contact to the piston. Now we're looking at a catastrophic failure.
Very much
so.
Yeah,
like I said, but buy often.
For sure. So we went through some of the basics at the beginning of the season. Let's kind of move into like a mid-season. Say this is our little example of a typical homeowner that got their mower started in the spring, changed the oil, did everything, and then they've been mowing in June or May, June, and we're right in the middle of July, and they're like, I'm about halfway through the season. I should probably look at my mower beyond putting gas in. What should they do at that point in time?
Certainly, and you should do a little bit of this in the onset too in spring when you pull it out of storage, is just kind of give the thing a once over and note if things are moving that shouldn't be or if things aren't moving that should, you need to address those. Visual inspection is usually pretty good, but typically if you're going to have a failure mid-season, you kind of know about it already. You've noticed it acting a little strange or cutting strange or whatever the case may be, but just a good walk around, and like we talked about, that air filter, you want to check that often, so that should be taken care of. Other than that, cut.
And we should be good for the season. Good for the season.
Should be good for the season.
So,
and that's, you spend a lot of time with your mower, so it's good to just be aware of what it's doing and why it's doing what it's doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the biggest things is because of doing a lot of demo stuff, I'm doing probably 5 or 6 different mowers. And
sure.
But boy, when you get back to the one that's your main one, the one that you've used, you can tell it's kind of like a relative. You can see, oh, you're not, Mr. Mower, you're not feeling good today. I can tell there's something wrong. Oh, I put poor quality gas in. I put 87 instead of the high octane.
Absolutely,
it does. So let's kind of jump to the end of the season. Now we've done our work for the season and we're ready to store. This is when I've talked to people, I've almost said this is almost a more critical time. I think.
Absolutely.
And let's kind of go into, because as you say, most folks are done. They're like, whoo, there we go. That season's over. And they put it into the garage and they walk away.
Yeah. Lock the shed.
Yep.
Yeah, I understand. That fuel is going to be the biggest thing. Now you can get into a practice where some of these things we talked about earlier with changing oil, spark plug, air filter. You can do that in the fall too. That's not going to hurt sitting over the winter, ready to go for summer or spring as it comes around. Mm-hmm. But fuel wise, you can get a lot of different answers to the best way to do this. I'll tell you what I recommend and what works for me.
Sure.
Is you got to use the crystal ball a little bit and kind of know when you're on your last tank of fuel, and treat that fuel for storage. And what I will do is I'll run that unit long enough to get some of that affected fuel through the carburetor, and then I'll either drain that fuel out, or if there's a fuel shut off, I'll shut it off and just run it until it runs itself out of fuel.
Sure.
So now you have good, clean, affected fuel was the last thing to go through that carburetor.
And when you're talking good, clean fuel, now that is where you were talking about the storage additive, that Toro storage additive that you put in?
Yes. Yeah, and there's a lot of different good products out there. I do like the Toro Premium stabilizer, but Stable or even Seafoam, a lot of that stuff does a good job.
And using it, of course, as directed, because it's one of those things.
As directed.
More is not always the best thing.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned, of course, the person could change air filter and oil in the fall. Is there any advantage or disadvantage of changing? Let's specifically look at oil in the fall, or if we let the oil sit in a machine that has got kind of gunk in it and waiting till spring. Is there going to be any advantage?
Nothing real detrimental. Okay. I mean, if you're taking care of that thing the way you should, anyways, your oil at the end of the prior season shouldn't be that bad. So I'm not worried about sludge buildup or anything like that. But you could do it either way. Just kind of be consistent with yourself. Pick when you're going to do it, and that's the same time I'm changing the batteries in the smoke alarms or whatever the case is.
Sure.
And make sure that because you don't want to miss a season.
Yeah.
You don't want to get into spring and think to yourself, yeah, I did that last fall and it never happened.
Yeah, there's that. You got to make sure it's done right. And occasionally I've gotten a story of someone who I dropped the oil in the fall and I was going to change it, and I got distracted and in the spring
finish the job.
You make sure. Yeah, double check.
Those things are typically educational.
You learn from your mistakes really quickly.
Absolutely.
Oh, nice. So we've kind of gone through the push mower world, and of course there's many similarities when it comes to these small engines between the push mower or the walk behind mowers and a riding type mower. Really, I would assume that the biggest difference is now you've got, with the transmission and a few other things, you've got just a couple more things to check.
Yeah, so we're going to add a couple of different things here when you get into the riders. The engine side of it is all pretty much the same, with the exception of most riders will have a fuel filter, and walk power mowers will not.
Yeah.
So you're going to want to replace that at the same time, and you want to be careful with that too, because there is fuel filters are directional. You don't want to put them in backwards because there's going to be some resistance there. So make sure you follow the arrows on the fuel filter and you put it in there. Obviously, you could have a little bit of gas spill here, so you want to be real careful, be in a ventilated area and know what you're doing. Again, if you're not comfortable with that portion of the job, hire it out. For sure. Let a pro do it.
Yes.
So engine-wise, that's going to be about the same. Now, like you said, we do add the drive side of it. Now, we work specifically with zero turns, and all Toro zero turns have 2 independent transmissions in them. Some of them have maintenance points and some don't. Depending upon your model. In the larger models, there is a spin-on filter and oil that you change. Otherwise, our drives are typically they're sealed, and the application fits the design life of that unit, so you don't have to worry about it. However, we need to keep them clean. Here again, we got to keep the heat off of it. There's fluid moving in there all the time, and there's fans on there. They can collect a lot of dirt throughout the season, so we need to make sure we're getting those blown off with compressed air or whatever the case may be. We don't recommend you use a garden hose or a pressure washer on lawnmowers, unless, in some models we have a washout port on the deck.
Yes.
And you can use that. But you're also instructed that after you shut the water off, you need to let that deck run until everything is dry. So we'll get into the deck side of that here in a little bit. But so drive-wise, you have your 2 independent transmissions, and you have a belt that goes from the engine to both of those transmissions. Same thing like we talked about on the walk power. You want to inspect that belt and make sure that it's in good shape. It's not cracked up. It's not glazed over. It's not getting hard, and it's sitting in the pulleys where it needs to be.
And with the hydrostatic, the zero turns, there's just a lot of things that are beyond pretty much every homeowner.
Yes.
I'm pretty good with wrenches, and that's even an area I would look at that belt and say, it needs to be replaced. I think it's going to go to the shop, because
more often than not,
wrestle with these things and replace belts. I'm comfortable with the taking care of the blades, and we'll get to that in a second, of course.
Yeah,
But beyond that, I think a lot of it is one of those things to keep it clean and inspect. And if you notice something's looking a little off, take it into the authorized repair shop.
absolutely. Look for the anomaly and see what's going on with it.
Yeah, for sure. So let's dive into that deck a little bit. You mentioned, of course,
Okay.
some have washout ports. What other things might we find on our zero turns that?
Depending upon your model, you might have some grease zerks. If you have a greasable spindles, we typically don't on the Toro time cutters or Titans. When you get into some of the larger stuff, Z-Master, commercial landscape stuff, you can find more grease zerks. But you want to make sure that you address those in the cadence that we outline in that operator's manual as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to make sure that we want to make sure that our spindle areas, when I say spindle, I'm talking about where the belt goes to a pulley, and that pulley runs a shaft going down to the deck that runs your blades. Depending upon your model, you might have a 1 to 3 blades in a zero turn.
Yes.
So we want to make sure those are staying clean and everything's clear of debris. Inspect that belt as well. Just like the drive belts, we're looking for the same thing. Any evidence of that it had been hot at one point. Because once it was hot, it's just going to keep getting hotter.
Right.
Now, when we're looking at that deck, it gets a little bit more involved. Same blade inspection we talked about on the lock power to make sure it's balanced, it's sharp, it's in good physical condition. But now you might run into a situation where you've noticed that deck is cutting a little uneven or something strange is going on. And it's what will happen is our blade tip to tip can get off if that deck has hit any substantial debris, rocks, large sticks, anything like that, in which case you're going to want to get that in your service dealer and have them take a look at that. But as far as the blade itself, it would be just like a walk power mower.
And one of the little nuances I've heard people talk about with their riders specifically is when all of a sudden they're saying that there's this unusual vibration.
Yeah.
And 9 chances out of 10, from my experience, when there's been an unusual vibration, we're going back to that stick you were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of talk a little bit about what kind of things that those sticks can do with those with the blades on those big riders.
Yeah, here's the short and simple of this. That deck is meant to cut grass. That's it.
Not the stick.
Anything beyond that, you're putting yourself in a tough spot. And with any of these things that we're talking about, once you've gone through your preseason inspection in spring, walk your yard. Go find the things that the neighbor's kid threw a softball out there, whatever the case is. There's always debris in my yard every spring.
Yep.
I don't know where it comes from, but there at least once a year, I'm going to find something that will hurt my lawnmower had I not found it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to help you out a little bit in the long run. Another thing on riding mowers you need to check is, and this gets a little more involved, but we do outline it in the operator's manual, is the deck level and rake. We want to make sure that deck is correct from side to side. But something that's often missed is that deck should be about 3/16 of an inch lower in front than is in the back. You get your best cut quality that way.
Sure. Okay.
If you have that sitting the other way or the deck is out of level, you can get some like mohawking or some scalping in your yard where you can see that it almost looks like you have a bent blade or something like that. And it's a matter of getting that deck straightened out. And
of course, some of that can be adjusted on your own if with you own your manual. And if there's something really majorly wrong, it might be again a trip back to the service center.
Absolutely. And if we outline the procedure in the operator's manual, we're pretty confident you can do it. An operator should be able to do that. If it's not in there, you're gonna want to see your local professional on that.
For sure.
Something else that's often missed is tire pressure.
That's right.
You want to make sure.
Go. Yep.
Yeah, we'll see complaints of cut quality because of a low tire. Because that deck starts sitting one way or the other, and it's just a matter of putting a few more pounds of pressure in one tire.
And I can attest to the other side of it. We had a poor cut because one of my boys, when he was putting air in it, decided that needed to have 40-some pounds of pressure, and I don't know how he didn't blow it up. Oof. But
got lucky on that one.
And that gave us the opposite. Now that tire is overinflated, and the unit is sitting a little too high on that side. And
yeah, absolutely.
It's like, what? Why did you? That looks like a balloon. But they learned. They learned.
They do learn. No
one was hurt, and it didn't blow up, so we were good with that. But yeah, the tire pressure. For those who are wondering how much to put in those tires, where would they be able to find that information?
In the operator's manual. Sometimes you can see it on the side of the tire. Once a unit gets a little older, it gets a little harder to see. But I would always go back to the operator's manual. And once you check it a couple times, you'll remember.
You get a feel for it.
Yeah, and typically it's 13 to 18 pounds, depending upon the models.
So our zero turn has this little thing in there called a battery.
Yeah.
Now, how do we, as what kind of things do we need to be doing with that battery to take care of it at the different times of the year? Let's just focus on that battery over the course of a full season.
Yeah, off season, our recommendation is going to be to disconnect that battery and put a battery tender on it, which will, if you're not familiar with the battery tender or maintainer, it's referred to as sometimes. It's almost like you're jump starting it, but it's keeping track of that voltage that's in there. And if it's not over, depending upon your battery tender, if it's not over, say 12.4 volts, it applies a light charge to it, a light slow charge, to keep it floating into a voltage range that keeps it healthy.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. So at the end of the season, where would you suggest storing the battery then, if you're putting a battery tender on it?
Above freezing.
Okay.
Above freezing is going to be the best. We don't recommend you bring them into your house because it is a lead acid battery. It's not something you want the pets or the kids to get into. But you want to keep it above freezing in the garage or someplace like that.
Mm-hmm. And plug it in and that'll maintain it throughout the winter. And then come spring, your battery is ready to roll.
Yeah, you bet. And they're pretty reasonable. There's a lot of retailers you can get these. I've seen them as cheap as $9.
Yeah.
Versus a replacement battery, that's pretty good value.
Mm-hmm. And as far as is there any kind of a cleaning that needs to be done with the batteries typically, or are they just?
Yeah, certainly. You'll notice corrosion on your battery terminals from time to time, and there is at your local auto parts store or some mass retailers, you can find a battery terminal cleaner, and even more so, you can get a battery terminal protectant. It's a spray on, almost like a spray paint, typically kind of red in color. Once you get them cleaned up and you have your cables attached, you want to give each one of those terminals a little squirt of that, and it'll help keep the corrosion off of there.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. That would definitely make it much easier to keep those things clean for the season.
Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about taking care of the keeping the mower pretty, the zero turn pretty during the season, because they do get dusty and dirty. And you mentioned, of course, the garden hose and not pressure washing. So how can I go and make that look like it's showroom new type of thing throughout the season?
Yeah, well, my recommendation is that after every use, you get your Toro Flex 460 volt leaf blower and blow the debris off the machine. If you are going to wash it, you need to dry it, especially when it comes to moving parts. A hot bearing loves cold water, and it'll quench as much as it can get, and that destroys bearings, especially on decks.
Sure. So yeah, obviously letting it cool down and sitting for a little while before you do much of anything.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, so blowing it off and wiping it off is the best route. Mm-hmm. Keep it clean.
And then once, is there anything that a person would do with? I had a neighbor at one time that would go out and he would actually wax it. So this was back when it was a rear engine rider, and he wanted the front engine, but it was more of a garden tractor, and he would wax it and make it all pretty. Does a person need to do anything with that to keep it looking nice, or are they just meant to last if you wash them, wipe them down?
Yeah, just keeping them clean is good enough typically. If you were to have an incident where you collided with a tree or something and you had some exposed metal where the paint was gone, you might want to address that because that's going to turn into a rust spot. Mm-hmm. As far as getting to the point where you're waxing your lawnmower, I appreciate your love for your lawnmower, but it's a little excessive.
Yes, he was a little excessive, but he did love his lawnmower, that's for sure. It was beautiful. There is that. So we talked about the battery at the end of the season. With a zero-turn fuel, is there anything that's different with storing that for the season when it comes to the fuel side?
Same situation, but you do get the benefit typically of having a fuel shut-off valve that allows you to leave fuel in the tank and shut that valve off and run the engine dry. Now, if you are going to leave fuel in your tank over the winter, I suggest you fill it as full as you can and treat that amount of fuel.
Okay. Now, why would you want to do that? What's the logic or the theory behind that?
The surface area versus volume when attracting moisture. And a lot of times what that stabilizer will do is it creates a little bit of a film in the top layer or on the top side of that fuel that helps keep that oxygen out of there and moisture out of there.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so filling it up all the way and treat it with treated and would be the best way.
You bet.
Interesting. Well, Wes, I think we've covered our bases. We've talked about our walk behind mowers. We talked about our zero turn, and we could go into battery powered stuff because you mentioned that, of course. But that'll be another video for another day here because that's a fun area which I enjoy an awful lot because that's
I do as well.
Yeah, I've really come to appreciate the idea. I can put in put the 60-volt batteries in, and I can put my earbuds in, and I can walk, and it's not loud, and I can mow and get the exercise, and hear all of my 80s music. It's great.
I agree.
Wes, if people have any or questions about anything, or they're looking to find some of those product manuals, where would be the best spot that they can go to find out more information about their mowers, the Toro mowers?
Toro.com.
Toro.com.
It's fairly easy. You can go right to the website. There's a search field up top. You can type your model number in there, and it'll bring up all the artifacts we have for that unit.
Excellent. And you've got some older models that aren't the current models. So if a person's looking for one that's 5 years old and isn't a current model, info is still there.
We have reference material back to 1955.
That's just about old enough.
I think so.
Wes, that's great stuff. Thank you much for being on today and for some great information. Gang, we'll put that link in the description below so you can go out to the website and check that out. And hopefully you're getting ready for the upcoming mowing season. Wes, once again,
getting ready.